You ever hear one of those stories that sticks with you? Not because it's particularly far-fetched, but because it feels too close to home, too real? That's exactly what happened when my friend Dan told me about something that went down a few years ago. He swears it happened, and honestly, when he gets that look in his eye and his voice drops to almost a whisper, you believe him. It's the kind of story that makes you double-check your own locks at night and second-guess that harmless neighbor across the street.
It all started when Dan and his wife, Kelly, moved into this little suburban neighborhood just outside the city. You know the type, rows of nearly identical houses with well-manicured lawns, kids playing in the streets, and neighbors who wave at you every time you drive by. Perfectly idyllic. For a young couple like them, it was the dream. Quiet, clean, safe. Or at least, that's how it seemed at first. The house next door, though, was different. It wasn't run down exactly, but it had this look about it. Like it was holding its breath, waiting for something. The lawn was overgrown. The shutters hung a little crooked, and the mailbox was barely hanging onto the post. Dan thought it was just another aging house, the kind you see all the time. But there was something about the guy who lived there. An old man, somewhere in his 70s, who never seemed to leave his house. Dan and Kelly tried to introduce themselves when they first moved in. You know, as new neighbors do. They knocked on his door a few times, but he never answered. At first, they figured he was just a typical reclusive old man, not interested in making new friends. No big deal. But it was the little things that started adding up. They never saw him during the day. His curtains were always drawn, and no matter the weather, his windows were never open. The only time they ever caught sight of him was late at night, shuffling around his dimly lit living room or peering out from behind the curtains. And then the digging started. It was Kelly who first noticed it. She'd been up late one night working on some last-minute project for work. It was past 2 a.m. and she was about to head to bed when she heard this faint noise coming from outside. A rhythmic, scraping sound, like something was being dragged across the dirt. At first, she thought it might be some stray animal rummaging around, but when she looked out the window, she saw him. The old man was out in his backyard, shoveling dirt under the moonlight. Kelly watched, frozen in place. He moved slowly, deliberately, like he'd done this 100 times before. He was digging something. A long, narrow trench, from what she could tell. It was eerie, watching him work in the dead of night, but Kelly figured it was weird old man stuff. Maybe he was burying yard waste or something. Still, it left her uneasy. The next morning, she told Dan about it. He brushed it off at first, telling her not to worry. Old people get weird about their yards, he said. Maybe he's into gardening or something. But that explanation didn't sit right with Kelly. Not when it happened again. And again. Every night, like clockwork, the old man was out there digging. It went on for weeks. Kelly started losing sleep over it. She'd lie in bed, listening for the familiar sound of the shovel piercing the earth, her mind racing with morbid thoughts. What could he possibly be doing out there every night? Dan started to get concerned too, especially when they noticed the old man never filled the trenches back in. He'd dig for hours, and in the morning, the holes would still be there. Empty, just waiting. One night, after Kelly begged him to, Dan decided to go out and take a closer look. It was just past 2 a.m. when he quietly slipped out of bed and crept to the backyard. He could hear the scraping sound faintly over the fence. The old man was at it again. Dan climbed onto a chair to peer over the fence, trying to get a better view. What he saw sent a chill down his spine. The old man wasn't just digging a trench. He was digging multiple. The backyard was a patchwork of shallow graves, each about 6 feet long and 2 feet wide. Dan stared in disbelief. There were at least a dozen of them, spread out like some macabre graveyard. He hurried back inside, his heart racing. Kelly was waiting for him, her eyes wide with fear. "What did you see?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Dan didn't want to scare her, but there was no hiding it now. "Graves," he said. "He's digging graves." Kelly's face went pale. "We need to call the police." Dan hesitated. It wasn't like they had any real proof. Just a weird old guy digging at night. What were they supposed to tell the cops? That their neighbor was creepy? But Kelly was insistent, and eventually, Dan agreed to call. They figured it was better to be safe than sorry. And they met. The cops showed up the next morning, knocking on the old man's door. He didn't answer. After several tries, they finally forced their way in, but when they came back out, they said the house was empty. The old man wasn't there. The police checked the backyard too, but they didn't seem too concerned. Sure, there were a bunch of holes, but they figured he was just digging for some kind of project. They told Dan and Kelly not to worry about it, but that didn't make them feel any better. If anything, it made things worse. The old man had vanished, and no one seemed to care. A few nights later, the digging stopped. Dan and Kelly thought maybe it was over. Maybe the old man had finally gone somewhere, or maybe the police had scared him off. But one night, around 2 a.m., Kelly heard something again. It wasn't the usual digging, though. This time, it was quieter, softer, almost like a whisper. It sounded like it was coming from beneath their own floorboards. Panicked, Dan grabbed a flashlight and went down to the basement. As soon as he opened the door, the smell hit him. It was thick, pungent, like rotting meat. He gagged, but pushed forward, his heart pounding in his chest. The basement floor was made of concrete, but in one corner it had been chipped away, revealing the dirt beneath. And there, half buried in the earth, was something that made Dan's blood run cold. A hand. It was small, pale, and decayed. The fingers curled like it had been reaching out for help. Dan stumbled backward, bile rising in his throat. He raced upstairs to call the police, but before he could dial, there was a knock at the door. It was the old man. Dan stood frozen, staring at the door. He could hear the old man breathing on the other side, slow and steady, like he had all the time in the world. Finally, Dan gathered the courage to speak. What do you want?" he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. There was a long pause. Then, the old man spoke, his voice low and raspy. "You shouldn't have looked," he said. "It's too late now." Dan slammed the door and locked it, his hands shaking. Kelly was hysterical by this point, begging him to leave, to run. But as they scrambled to gather their things, they heard it. The sound of dirt being shoveled right outside their window. The police arrived minutes later, but by then, the old man was gone. They searched the backyard, the basement, and even dug up the shallow graves, but found nothing. No bodies, no hand, nothing. It was like the old man had vanished into thin air, taking his dark secret with him. Dan and Kelly moved out a week later. They couldn't stay there anymore, not after what they'd seen, or thought they'd seen. To this day, Dan swears it happened, every last detail, and I believe him. You can see it in his eyes when he talks about it. That haunted look, like he's still waiting for the old man to come back. After all, some things refuse to stay buried.
My cousin Sarah and her husband Mark were always the adventurous type. They loved the thrill of the unknown, which is why they jumped at the chance to buy a charming old house in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of town. As Sarah recounted their chilling experience to me over a cup of coffee, her usually bright eyes were clouded with a darkness that sent shivers down my spine. This is their story, as she told it to me. Sarah and Mark moved into their new home on a crisp autumn day. The house was a classic Victorian, complete with a wraparound porch and intricate woodwork. They were thrilled. It was everything they had ever wanted. The neighborhood was calm, filled with the soft chirping of birds and the occasional rustling of leaves. It seemed like the perfect place to start their new life together. Across the street lived an elderly man named Mr. Whitaker. He was a frail figure, always peering out of his window. At first, Sarah and Mark thought nothing of it. "He's just a lonely old man," they told themselves, brushing off his constant watchfulness as harmless curiosity. Days turned into weeks, and the couple settled into their new routine. However, they couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Mr. Whitaker's gaze followed them everywhere, whether they were gardening, unloading groceries, or simply enjoying a quiet evening on their porch. His eyes never left them. Strange things started to happen. Items from their yard began to disappear. A garden gnome, a pair of gardening gloves, even Sarah's favorite wind chime vanished without a trace. Sarah chalked it up to local kids playing pranks, but Mark was not so sure. His unease grew when they started hearing footsteps outside their house at night, slow and deliberate, like someone was pacing back and forth. Determined to get to the bottom of the mystery, Mark installed security cameras around the property. They waited anxiously for any sign of the intruder. It wasn't long before the cameras captured something disturbing. In the grainy footage, they saw Mr. Whitaker creeping around their house at odd hours, his gaunt figure barely illuminated by the moonlight. Furious and frightened, Mark marched over to confront the old man. Mr. Whitaker's house was a mirror image of theirs, but in disrepair. The garden was overgrown, and the paint was peeling. When Mark pounded on the door, it creaked open slowly, revealing Mr. Whitaker standing in the dimly lit hallway.
"What the hell are you doing around our house?"
Mark demanded, his voice shaking with anger. Mr. Whitaker's eyes were wide, almost manic.
"I'm protecting you."
He whispered, his voice raspy and urgent.
"You don't understand. It's what's inside your walls. It's been there for years, waiting."
Mark was taken aback.
"What are you talking about?"
"The house. It's alive."
Mr. Whitaker continued, his voice dropping to a trembling whisper.
"It feeds on fear. It needs new blood."
Mark dismissed the old man's warnings as the ramblings of a senile mind. He returned home, shaken but resolute.
"He's just a crazy old man."
He told Sarah, trying to reassure her. "There's nothing to worry about." But the noises inside the house grew louder. At night, they heard scratching within the walls, faint whispers that seemed to echo through the empty rooms. Sarah started seeing shadows flitting at the edge of her vision, always disappearing when she turned to look. One night, as they lay in bed, the noise became unbearable. It was a low, guttural growl, accompanied by the sound of something heavy being dragged across the attic floor. Mark grabbed a flashlight and headed up, determined to put an end to the madness. The attic was a dark, dusty space filled with old furniture and forgotten relics. As Mark swept the flashlight around, he saw nothing out of the ordinary. But the growling persisted, louder and more menacing. He followed the sound to a corner where an old trunk sat, covered in cobwebs. Taking a deep breath, he opened the trunk. Inside, he found old photographs, letters, and a journal. The journal belonged to the house's original owner, a man named Jonathan Blackwood. As Mark flipped through the pages, his blood ran cold. The journal detailed a series of gruesome murders that had taken place in the house over a century ago. Victims were found mutilated, their bodies dismembered and partially devoured. The last entry was the most chilling. It spoke of a dark presence within the house, something that fed on the fear and suffering of its inhabitants. Jonathan had tried to contain it, but he feared it was only a matter of time before it broke free. Mark and Sarah realized they were in grave danger. They decided to leave, but the house seemed to have other plans. As they packed their belongings, the walls themselves seemed to close in on them. The temperature dropped, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent. That night, the house claimed its first victim. Sarah woke to find Mark missing. She searched the house frantically, her heart pounding in her chest. In the attic, she found him, or what was left of him. Mark's body was torn apart, his limbs scattered like broken toys. His face was frozen in a mask of terror, his eyes wide open, staring into the abyss. Sarah was paralyzed with grief and fear, but she knew she had to get out. As she stumbled down the stairs, she saw Mr. Whitaker standing in the doorway, his eyes filled with sorrow.
I tried to warn you.
He said, his voice breaking.
It's too late now.
Sarah felt a surge of anger.
Why didn't you do anything?
She screamed.
I'm too old, too weak.
He whispered.
But you can still fight it.
With Mr. Whitaker's help, Sarah devised a plan. They needed to perform an ancient ritual described in Jonathan Blackwood's journal to banish the entity. They gathered the necessary items, candles, salt, and a silver dagger, and prepared to face the darkness head-on. The house seemed to resist their efforts. The moment Sarah and Mr. Whitaker began to gather the necessary items, a set of old candles, a box of salt, and a silver dagger, strange things started happening. The walls groaned as if in pain, and an unnatural chill settled over the rooms. The air grew thick with an indescribable malice, making it hard to breathe. They set up the ritual in the living room, the largest space available. The antique furniture was pushed aside to make room for a large salt circle. Mr. Whitaker, despite his frail condition, moved with surprising agility, his hands steady as he poured the salt in a perfect ring. Sarah lit the candles, their flickering flames casting eerie shadows on the walls. As they began the incantation from Jonathan Blackwood's journal, the temperature dropped even further. Their breath turned to mist, and an oppressive silence fell over the room. The growling intensified, now accompanied by a sinister whispering that seemed to come from the walls themselves. The words were unintelligible, but the malevolence behind them was clear. Suddenly, the house reacted violently. Doors slammed shut with deafening force, the windows shattered, and the floorboards creaked as if something massive was moving beneath them. The salt circle began to tremble, and the candles flickered wildly, their flames struggling to stay alight. "Hold steady!" Mr. Whitaker shouted, his voice barely audible over the cacophony. "We mustn't break the circle." Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, but she held her ground, continuing to chant the incantation. The shadows in the room began to coalesce, swirling around them like a living nightmare. The darkness grew thicker, almost tangible, pressing in on them from all sides. Then it appeared. The entity was a grotesque, twisted being, its form constantly shifting and writhing. Its eyes burned with a malevolent fire, and its mouth twisted into a snarl, revealing rows of jagged teeth. It let out a blood-curdling scream that reverberated through the house, shaking the very foundation. The creature lunged at them, its claws extended, aiming for Sarah. She raised the silver dagger, her hands shaking but determined. As the creature closed in, she plunged the dagger into its heart with all her strength. The entity let out another ear-piercing scream, thrashing violently as it tried to free itself. For a moment, Sarah thought the dagger had no effect, but then the creature began to disintegrate, its form unraveling like smoke in the wind. The growling stopped, replaced by a deafening silence. The oppressive weight lifted, and the shadows dissipated, revealing the room in disarray but free of the dark presence. Sarah collapsed to her knees, her body trembling with exhaustion and relief. Mr. Whitaker quickly moved to her side, his eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and pride.
You did it.
He said softly, his voice breaking.
You saved us.
Sarah looked around the room, now eerily quiet and still. The house, once a place of terror, seemed almost peaceful. She felt a surge of triumph, but also a deep sadness for the loss of Mark and the horrors they had endured.
Is it really over?
She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Whitaker nodded. For now, the entity is gone, but the house will always carry its scars, as will you. Sarah knew he was right. The experience had changed her forever. She had faced the darkness and survived, but the memory of that night would haunt her for the rest of her life. They gathered their belongings and left the house, not daring to look back. The neighborhood was left to wonder about the strange events that had transpired within those walls. Some say the house still holds a dark secret, waiting for its next victims. But Sarah knew the truth. She had faced the darkness and survived, but the scars would remain forever. The house fell silent. The oppressive weight lifted, and the shadows dissipated. Sarah collapsed, exhausted but relieved. Mr. Whitaker helped her to her feet, his eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and pride. "You did it," he said softly. "You saved us." Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her face. But at what cost? She left the house that night, never to return. The neighborhood was left to wonder about the strange events that had transpired within those walls. Some say the house still holds a dark secret, waiting for its next victims. But Sarah knew the truth. She had faced the darkness and survived, but the scars would remain forever. As Sarah finished her story, I sat in stunned silence. The horror she had endured was unimaginable. She looked at me with haunted eyes and said, "Be careful where you choose to call home. Some places are not meant for the living." Her words echoed in my mind long after she left. The house still stands, a silent sentinel to the horrors that occurred within its walls. And sometimes, on a quiet night, you can still hear the whispers of the past, a reminder of the darkness that lurks just beyond the edge of our understanding.
I first heard this story from a guy who used to live in my old apartment building, a place I moved out of about 2 years ago. He wasn't the type to make things up, and the way he told it made me feel like he was genuinely shaken by what happened. Let's just call him Mark. He didn't like to talk about it, but over a couple of beers one night, he let the whole thing out. This was back when he'd just moved into that same building, a pretty standard old brick apartment complex in the middle of the city. Nothing special. The kind of place where you heard people's footsteps through the ceiling and smelled their dinners through the walls. He'd been there for only about a month when he first met his next-door neighbor, an older woman named Mrs. Adler. She was in her late 60s, maybe early 70s, with sharp blue eyes and a quiet, almost distant demeanor. They'd often cross paths in the hallway, and after a couple of brief hellos, they began exchanging casual pleasantries. Mrs. Adler was the type who always wore the same faded floral dress, shuffled quietly in her orthopedic shoes, and held onto her keychain like it was something precious. Mark always thought she seemed lonely, the kind of person who lived in the past, stuck in memories of better times. At first, their conversations were nothing special. A little about the weather, some chit-chat about the noise coming from upstairs. The typical stuff neighbors talk about. But as they spoke more often, Mark started to notice that Mrs. Adler was always on edge, her hands twitching as if she was constantly nervous. And her eyes, they never stayed still, darting around like she expected something to happen. She mentioned her son once in passing, but when Mark asked about him, she quickly changed the subject. Something about her made him feel sorry for her, but he didn't think much beyond that. Then one day she disappeared. It wasn't like she just vanished into thin air, at least not at first. Mark noticed one morning that he hadn't seen Mrs. Adler in a few days. He thought maybe she'd gone to visit family or something, but her mailbox in the lobby started to overflow. A few days turned into a week, then 2 weeks, and by then her absence felt eerie. Mark mentioned it to some of the other neighbors, but no one seemed to care. A couple of them just shrugged it off, and the building manager, a gruff guy named Ed, told him to mind his own business. But Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He knocked on her door a few times, hoping she was just sick or something, but there was never any answer. Her apartment was always quiet, and the silence in that part of the hallway felt heavy, like the air had been sucked out of it. What really got to Mark was that no one else seemed to notice. Everyone just went on with their lives. The building manager didn't do anything, and none of the neighbors seemed to miss her. The mail piled up, and her door stayed closed. It was like she never existed at all. About 3 weeks into Mrs. Adler's absence, Mark decided to report it to the building management again. This time, Ed gave him a weird look, as if he didn't know who Mark was talking about. When Mark insisted, Ed told him, flat out, that there was no one by the name of Mrs. Adler living in the building. Mark was floored. "What do you mean she doesn't exist?" he asked. Ed shrugged, completely unfazed. "There's no one by that name in our records, no one in that apartment. You sure you're not just imagining things?" That comment set Mark off. He knew Mrs. Adler was real. He'd spoken to her. He'd seen her walking the halls every day. But Ed just shook his head and walked away, leaving Mark standing there, more confused than ever. Something was definitely wrong. Mrs. Adler was real. He wasn't imagining it. But why would the building manager claim she never existed? It didn't make any sense. That night, Mark sat in his apartment, staring at the wall that separated his place from hers. His mind raced with possibilities. Had she moved out without telling anyone? Was there something more sinister going on? The more he thought about it, the more obsessed he became. He couldn't just let it go. A few nights later, Mark made a decision. He waited until the building was quiet, and then, with his heart pounding in his chest, he crept out into the hallway. He had an old lock-picking set he'd messed around with in college, and he brought it with him. It felt wrong, but he had to know what had happened to Mrs. Adler. The lock on her door was old and rusty, and it didn't take long to get it open. When the door clicked, Mark hesitated, his hand on the knob. He wasn't sure what he was expecting, but what he found was far worse than anything he could have imagined. The first thing that hit him was the smell, a thick, rotting stench that made his stomach churn. He gagged, covering his mouth with his sleeve, and stepped inside. The apartment was dark, the curtains drawn tight. Mark reached for the light switch, but it didn't work. As his eyes adjusted to the dim light, he saw that the place was a mess. The furniture was overturned, and there were deep gouges in the walls, like someone had clawed at them in desperation. Papers were scattered everywhere, old bills, receipts, and what looked like handwritten letters. The air was thick with dust, and everything felt cold, like the place had been abandoned for a long time. But that wasn't the worst part. In the middle of the living room, there was blood. A lot of it. Dark, dried stains soaked into the carpet, splattered across the floor, and smeared along the walls. Mark's mind went blank for a moment, his thoughts racing too fast to make sense of what he was seeing. Something terrible had happened here. He moved further into the apartment, careful not to touch anything. The bathroom door was ajar, and as he nudged it open, he froze. The mirror was shattered, shards of glass glinting in the faint light, and scrawled across the broken surface, in what looked like dried blood, were the words, "They took me. You're next." Mark stumbled back, his heart hammering in his chest. His mind screamed at him to get out, but something compelled him to keep going. He needed to know what had happened. He couldn't just leave without understanding. He moved towards the bedroom, every step heavier than the last. When he pushed open the door, he saw something that made his blood run cold. On the bed, lying twisted and broken, was a body, or what was left of one. The figure was so mutilated it was hard to tell if it was even human anymore. Flesh hung loosely from the bones, and the stench of decay was overwhelming. Mark couldn't breathe. His eyes locked onto the ruined face. It was Mrs. Adler. She'd been dead for days, maybe weeks. Her eyes were still open, staring blankly at the ceiling, her mouth frozen in a silent scream. It was clear she had died in agony, but there were no obvious signs of what had killed her. No weapons, no tracks, nothing. Just a cold, violent death in a forgotten apartment. Mark backed away slowly, bile rising in his throat. He couldn't take it anymore. He had to get out. He turned and bolted for the door, slamming it behind him as he stumbled into the hallway. His mind raced with 1,000 questions, none of which had answers. Who had taken her? What did the message in the mirror mean? Was someone coming for him next? For the next few days, Mark kept to himself. He couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't stop thinking about what he'd seen. He considered going to the police, but what would he even say? That he broke into his neighbor's apartment and found her dead? That the building manager claimed she never existed? It sounded insane. And then, strange things started happening. It was small stuff at first. Noises in the walls, whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. Mark tried to convince himself it was just his imagination, but the sounds grew louder every night. Scratching, tapping. Like something or someone was inside the walls, trying to get out. Then one night, he woke up to the sound of footsteps in his apartment. His heart raced as he sat up in bed, listening. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, moving from room to room. He grabbed a baseball bat from under his bed and crept out into the hallway. The apartment was dark, but he could feel that he wasn't alone. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then, from the shadows, a voice whispered, "You're next." Mark swung the bat wildly, but there was nothing there, just empty space. His breath came in ragged gasps as he backed into his bedroom and locked the door. The whispers continued, growing louder and more insistent, until they filled the entire apartment. The next morning, Mark packed up whatever he could carry and left. He didn't tell anyone where he was going. He just ran. I moved into that building a few months after Mark left, completely unaware of what had happened. It wasn't until I ran into him at a bar, years later, that I heard the story. He told me he never found out what really happened to Mrs. Adler or who or what had killed her.
Thank you for listening. We hope you've enjoyed the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell button, and we'll notify you when the next story comes out.